Day one was about getting the car to zero. We took off the panels, ripped out the floors, and cleaned out the inside and outside.
So for today, we're going to get up on the roof, we're going to cut a hole for the fan, and install the solar panels. So let's get to it.
The first thing we're tackling on the roof is the vent fan. We chose the Fan-tastic 2250 model. It has 3 fan speeds and reversible fan direction, meaning it can pull air in from the outside or push air out from the inside of the fan. It also has a built-in thermostat, so the fan can automatically turn on or off depending on the temperature you set it to.
The fan comes with a foam template that we positioned on the roof and traced. Luckily, we found that the first generation Sprinters have a section on the roof adjacent to the sliding door where a factory fan or passenger AC unit mounts, so it was a perfect place for us to mount the Fan-tastic fan without interfering with the ribs or other structural members.
We laid painter's tape along the perimeter to help minimize scratches from the jigsaw shoe when we cut out the hole. Using a step drill bit, we drilled a 1/2-inch hole near each of the corners so the jigsaw can articulate from one side to the next. Then we cut out the hole using a fine-tooth metal cutting blade. This process is loud, so make sure to have some hearing protection. To minimize cleanup inside the van, we taped a large garbage bag underneath our cut line to catch all the metal shavings.
Once the edges were deburred, we sprayed some semi-gloss white paint to seal the bare metal. When the paint dried, I cleaned up the perimeter with some simple green to prep it for some sealant. Meanwhile, Laura cut some 1x2s and drilled pocket holes to make the frame for the fan. This frame will be mounted under the fan from inside the van, essentially sandwiching the roof skin in between. It gives extra material for the fan mounting screws to bite into, as well as support for the finishing trim once the ceiling panels are installed.
We used Bostik 7003 seam sealer because we had a few tubes from a previous project. Another popular choice of sealant is Sikaflex 252, which is a bit easier to find than Bostik, so we'll leave a link in the description below. After laying sealant on the perimeter of the hole, we placed the fan into position, making sure to give it a shimmy from side to side so the sealant can spread out. The hinge side of the fan is facing the front of the car. While I held the wooden frame underneath from inside the van, Lewis drove a couple self-tapping metal to wood screws in. We used 1¼ inch long screws, which were slightly too long. We later grinded those flush with an angle grinder, but 1-inch screws would have been perfect.
After all the screws were in, we taped the perimeter of the fan and generously applied exterior window sealant around the seams and screw holes to prevent any leaks. To celebrate the end of the fan install, we peeled off the cellophane.
Rather than using off-the-shelf roof rails, we used low-profile aluminum strut channels that are 6 feet long. Unlike the newer body style, our Sprinter doesn't have OEM mounting locations, so we used 3 M8 Rivnuts to secure each of the channels.
Using a step bit, we drilled a hole large enough for the Rivnut to sit into snugly. There's no need to buy a special Rivnut tool. You can use a long bolt with the same thread pitch as the Rivnut, a couple of nuts that are larger than the bolt, we used M10 nuts, and a couple of washers. Once you have all the pieces threaded together, just insert the assembly into the hole and tighten the bolt using an impact drill, while holding it upright by the nuts with a wrench. By tightening a little bit at a time, you'll start to feel the rivnut compress. Once the tightening resistance increases again, you can loosen the bolt and the rivnut will stay in place. But be sure not to over tighten the bolt because it could strip the knurls on the rivnut after it's compressed and it's a pain to get out.
Once we got all the rivnuts installed, we made brackets for the solar panels using 1¼ inch angle aluminum. We cut them to length to have 4 2-feet long pieces that we can attach on the short sides of the panel. We made slotted holes on the sides that mount on the rails by measuring 2 equally spaced points, drilling holes slightly larger than an M8 bolt, and cutting the material out between the 2 holes with a jigsaw. We filed the edges smooth as well. Still watching? Please click the subscribe button and notification bell below. It really helps our channel grow, and Layla appreciates you supporting her parents.
After cleaning up the slots, we measured 3 equally spaced points along the length of the other leg, and drilled holes slightly larger than the 1/8 inch rivets we'll use to attach onto the solar panels. Since the length of the angled aluminum is shorter than the width of the panels, we roughly centered it and transferred the hole locations with a marker. Using the same drill bit from before, we used our hand drill to drill the holes we marked on the solar panels.
We made sure the holes were aligned by fitting the rivets through the angle aluminum and into the solar panels before fastening. Then we fastened the rivets using the rivet tool. It takes a few pumps of the handle before there's enough tension to deform the tail and break off the mandrel, which is the piece that sticks out and goes into the tool. The tail is the part that mushrooms on the backside. We fastened the rest of the brackets with rivets and ended up with a pretty sturdy mounting solution.
Before we can finish installing the roof rails and the panels, we had to address all the surface rust on the roof. There are seams where sections of the body overlap and are spot welded together, which is a big issue with water leakage on some vans. Also, for our van, it looked like somebody drove through low clearance and scratched through the paint in some areas. We used a wire wheel to remove the surface rust and sprayed a coat of rust inhibitor.
We also applied a bead of the same Bostik sealant we used when mounting the fan on the seams and smoothed it out with our finger. Since the sealant is paintable, a nice coat of fresh paint should make it look relatively OEM.
Finally, it was time to mount the solar panels. Once we positioned the rails over the rivnut locations, we slid in the channel nuts that will be used to mount the solar panels before tightening the mounting bolts for the rails. We used a large diameter fender washer to make sure that we have enough surface area clamping force. We also used blue Loctite on the threads to make sure the bolt doesn't loosen due to the vibrations on the road. With the rails attached to the roof, we placed the panels on top, aligning the slotted holes on the brackets with the channel nuts. We used a parallel wiring harness adapter to connect the 2 solar panels and routed the output connectors between the 2 panels as well.
Since the mounting bolts were a little short, Lewis used a magnet to hold the channel nuts high enough for the bolts to catch a few threads. Then we used blue Loctite on these bolts as well and torqued them down with an impact driver. If you really want it to be proper, you should get a torque wrench and manually torque the mounting bolts down to around 30 foot-pounds or so. But I think the impact driver is good enough. Do what makes you happy. We chose to have the electrical area towards the middle of the van, so placing the cable gland between the two solar panels was the best location for our setup. We used a 1 1/4 inch metal hole saw, cleaned up the edges with a file, and sprayed the raw metal with paint.
We installed MC4 connectors on 12 gauge wire to connect with the parallel harness, and fed the wires through the gland. We'll go into more detail about the electrical setup in another video, so stay tuned for that. To seal out the mating surface, we use some DAP silicone sealant generously along the flange, and use self-tapping metal screws to fasten it to the roof. The reason we chose to use the black sealant for the cable glands was out of pure laziness. The tube of white sealant was inside the van, and
ain't nobody getting time for this.
Overall, we're super happy with how the roof equipment worked out. The solar panels are pretty low profile and arranged for easy maintenance in the future. The fan installation also couldn't have gone any smoother.
in the next video we're going to tackle the windows, so be sure to subscribe and tune in for that.
Thanks for watching!